Angelica Sperbs. Hello, welcome to our third episode of Sperbs Herbs, our second of our singles series. Today we are going to be talking about Shā Rén, Amomum fructus, and it is presented by me, as always, Dr. Greg Sperber. And so let's get into it. Today's podcast, if you would like to support us, please go to our webpage at www.sperbsherbs.com. That's SPERBSHERBS.com. Click on the Amazon banner when you want to purchase something from Amazon, and we will get a small portion of that, and that will help support us continuing this podcast. We would really appreciate it. Thank you. If you are an acupuncturist, this podcast, as well as others, are approved for CEUs and NCCAOM PDAs at a reasonable cost, available at our CEU website, www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's .org. But if you slip up and put .com, it'll still send you to the right place. Again, that's www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. We are looking for sponsors for our podcasts. If you're looking for effective, super targeted, personalized advertising with an excellent return on investment, check out the advertising section of sperbsherbs.com. Let's get into it. So Shā Rén, I want to tell you a little bit about Shā Rén before we get into it. Shā Rén is probably my favorite herb for a lot of reasons. First of all, Shā Rén, its functions are for me. They're built for me. It's probably a little warming for me, but other than that, it dries dampness, it moves qi. It is a fantastic herb for that. We're going to get into all that in just a little bit. But it's also one of the few really, really tasty herbs. I mean, it is just delicious. And we're going to get into that in just a minute, and we'll talk about its uses in that function. But so it's not one of those herbs. So when I was going through school, there was a buddy of mine, a classmate of mine, Andy Rosenfarb is out there. He practices in New Jersey. Andy and I, we had samples of all the herbs, and Andy and I would look at each other and we'd pop each herb into our mouths as we looked at each other. Most of them tasted horrible. Shā Rén, cardamom was, well, we're going to get into whether it's cardamom, but it was delicious. Loved it. It was fantastic. By the way, we did stop that tradition when we had super concentrated aloe vera. It was a resin, and we put that on our tongue, and we were both disgusted by it. And that was probably not a bad thing, because right after that was when we started getting into some of the excrements. So it was probably a good place for us to stop tasting all the herbs. But Shā Rén, just from the very beginning, I just clicked with. I think it's an amazing herb. And part of the reason why it's the second single herb that we're discussing on Sperbs Herbs. So when I was going through my master's program, I learned that it was cardamom, that this was cardamom. Amomum fructus was cardamom. And I always thought that. I taught that for not years, decades. I taught this herb as cardamom. I just checked my old textbook. Sure enough, it says it is grains of paradise fruit, cardamom. So this is definitely, according to my old textbook, cardamom. And this is why I love what I do here on Sperbs Herbs. It isn't cardamom. It isn't cardamom at all. It tastes similar, but it is not cardamom. Let's get into that a little bit. Of course, just knowing that our herb for today, Shā Rén, is not cardamom won't stop me from talking about cardamom. Not only is Shā Rén one of my all-time favorite herbs, cardamom is one of my all-time favorite spices. It has a flavor profile that is unlike any other spice. And those of you who have tasted it, most of you have hopefully at this point, if in nothing else in chai tea. It is just an amazing, fragrant, tasty spice. So even though Shā Rén, our herb for the day, is not cardamom, it is cardamom adjacent. And so we're going to talk about how this fits into the cardamom families and where we're looking, why it's important, and why it's not totally wrong to talk about cardamom in the context of Shā Rén. So they are related, and we're going to talk about the relationship right now. Let's talk about cardamom. There are 3 types of cardamom generally considered. There is green, there is black, and there is white cardamom. Green cardamom is considered the true cardamom. The most common Latin name for this spice is Eleutheria cardamomus. Again, when it gets into Latin pronunciations, my Latin pronunciation is probably worse than my Chinese pronunciation, which gives you an idea of how bad both are. So the Latin name for true cardamom, the green cardamom, is Eleutheria cardamomum. So it has that cardamom in Latinate in there. Our herb for this week is not even Eleutheria. That's the genus. It's a totally different genus. It's Amomum. It's Amomum fructus or Amomi fructus. The difference between Amomum and Amomi is Amomi is plural, Amomum is singular in the Latin. As far as I know, those of you who have a Latin background can certainly correct me. So our herb, Shā Rén, is actually Amomum villosum. It is a completely different genus. If you haven't heard this term, or you haven't heard this term genus since you were in high school, we're going to get into it. We're going to explain what all that means right now. Because right now we look at Eleutheria cardamomum versus Amomum villosum. And guess what? They don't sound similar at all. But they are. So let's talk about that. And to do that, we need to get into biological taxonomy. So we need to talk a little bit about how biological organisms are organized, and taxonomy is basically a way of labeling things. So we're going to stroll a little bit into biology for a moment to discuss the differences in genera. So I said they had different genus. They had the Eleutheria and the Amomum. The singular, that's a genus, and plural is genera. So when we're talking about both of them, it's genera. So getting into biological taxonomy, you guys might remember this from from high school. Those of you who took biology in college may have touched on it. It's fairly basic biology, and we're talking about the hierarchical taxonomy of organisms. And this was developed in the 18th century by a Swedish naturalist named Carl Linnaeus, and he developed what he called the Systema Naturae. Again, some more Latin. There's a lot of Latin in today's Sperbs herbs. And what the Systema Naturae did was classify organisms and even minerals, though we don't use that so much anymore, into a hierarchical taxonomy. So if you remember, there was a reverse pyramid with kingdoms, or now we use domains at the top, and they go all the way down to species at the bottom. So when we're talking about Eleutheria cardamomum, and we're talking about Amomum villosum, we're talking about species. It actually is the genus and the species. So this Systema Naturae has changed quite a bit throughout the centuries. It was, in the 1700s, so it's over 300 years old, and is now used to describe how organisms are related or not related to each other. And I gotta say, especially as we get into some of the lower, not the broad domains and kingdoms, but as we get into the lower areas of the hierarchical taxonomy, genetics and the ability to actually do genetic classification of organisms helped a lot and moved a lot of animals and organisms into different species, genera, families, those sort of things. So that has been a real awakening of our biology in the last 50, 60 years. The biological taxonomy starts to classify organisms in their broadest sense into domains. And there are really 3 major domains. Not included in this is viruses, because viruses, there's still some controversy about whether or not viruses are alive or they just hijack things, but they have their own they follow a similar schema, but they mean different things than what we're going to be talking about. So that's a separate thing. But right now, the 3 major domains are archaea. We'll get to that in just a second. Bacteria, so you're familiar with bacteria, and eukarya. Eukarya translates as true cells. So eukarya means true cells. And so those are everything other than bacteria and archaea. If you haven't heard this term archaea, that's because it's relatively recent in the last couple decades. And it's this whole new form of life. It's older, we think, than bacteria and anything else. And you will have, if you've heard about them, we've been finding them in extreme, they're called extremophiles, extreme places on Earth. So they will be at the vents from lava vents at the bottom of the ocean, or even closer, they've found them in some of the hot springs where it's too hot for anything else. And not only just too hot, but just the chemical makeup is just too extreme for anything to exist there that we know of before. And we've cultured those, and we found these archaea. They're kind of like proto bacteria. They have, if you look at bacteria, there's similarities between them and eukarya, and there are similarities between archaea and the bacteria as well. So it's just a fascinating domain. We're not going to get into it here, but it is definitely something if you're interested to research. And again, they've only discovered in the last 20 years or so. It's relatively recent. So then after domains, we have our kingdoms. So when I was in high school, there were no domains. I think we started with kingdoms, and now we have domains as the highest level of the hierarchy, and next up is kingdoms. So for example, in eukarya domain, there are plants, animals, protists, and fungi. Those would be the four kingdoms under the eukarya domain. So obviously, we're going to be talking about plants as we get into what we're talking about today. I might use a few examples of the animals, but plants are going to be where we're at. So let's continue our discussion of biological taxonomy. So as we get more specific, we move through phylum. The plural for phylum is phyla. We have classes, orders, and most specifically, we land on family, genus or genera for the plural, and species. And species is both plural and singular. So those are the different levels. We have domain, kingdom, phyla, classes, orders, families, genera, and species. Now, family is important to our discussion, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. So far we've talked about genera and genus and species, even if we haven't quite labeled them as such. We've talked about genus for sure, but we're getting into species now. So when you see a Latin name of an organism, in our case a plant, it is described by what is known as binomial nomenclature. So binomial means two, and nomenclature means names. So two names. The nomenclature is a capitalized genus followed by the lowercase species name. So that's the binomial. So the first of the two names is the genus, and it is capitalized, and then the second is lowercase and species. And they're often they're either italicized or sometimes they're underlined, but there should be separated in that context with either italics or underlining. And so what we were talking about is Elateria cardamomum. So Elateria would be the genus, and cardamomum would be the species under that genus. Or we were talking about Amomum villosum. So Amomum would be the genus, and villosum would be the species. So that's the binomial nomenclature that is common throughout all of the biological taxonomy. But you can, after that binomial, the two names, it can be followed by more specific names about the part of the plant. So for example, in herbology, we'll talk about that part of the plant. So we'll say fructus or semen, fructus meaning the fruit of the plant, or semen meaning the seed of the plant, or all number radix for root. There's a whole bunch. There will be. We will discuss all the different parts of a plant at some point on one of these Sperbs herbs. You can also, if you're not specific like in herbology, we'll use that, but the different parts aren't necessarily as useful for the nomenclature in other contexts. So you might have a specific subspecies or a cultivar. A cultivar is basically a subspecies that was cultivated and used for whatever thing. So, for example, we would have, in the case of a peach, there's lots of different kinds of peaches. So you would have the species would be the normal genus and species, but then after that, it might be all the different varieties, a name for whichever variety there is. And I don't even know what kind of varieties. There's tons of them. That would be how you would separate. They'd all be of the species, and then you would separate that out. So one of the examples of this would be for our herb today. I said it's Amomum villosum, but the Latin name is actually Amomum villosum fructus, because we are actually, the herb is the fruit of the Amomum villosum plant. It's not the roots or the rhizomes, the branches, nothing like that. We've been talking around these different levels of species, genus, and family, but let's get into what is the definition of each of these. So the definitions of family and genus are a little vague. A family is more specific than an order, and a genus is more specific than a family. That's about it. Other than that, they get debated by specialists in this context. They are, things can move. They can, something can start as one and move to another as more information is discovered. So it's a little vague as to what specifically is a genus and what specifically is a family. What we can say is a family is more specific than an order, and a genus is more specific than a family. And we could also say that things that are in a family have more in common than things that are in an order. And the same token, things that are in a genus are more similar than things that are in a family. Generally, though, overall, families are more stable than genera. Species and genera, they will change. They will mutate. They will change with environmental pressures and things like that. Genera and species are a little bit more fluid and flexible than families. Families tend to be a little bit more stable than actual genera are. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting. Species. So again, there can be different definitions of this, but one of the classic definitions, and still used to a large extent, is it is the largest group of individuals that can mate and produce fertile offspring. Now, that's important, fertile. Within a genus, you might be able to reproduce, but the offspring will not be fertile. So that is a common thing. And the species, as we know, is technically the lowest level of the hierarchy, though there are, like we said, there are variants within the species. So you can get more specific than a species, but not within a biological taxonomy sort of thing. So generally we look at what if individuals can actually reproduce and have fertile offspring, and then we can use other things other than that criteria. They can also be determined by such things as DNA, morphology. Morphology means the shape and how, what it looks like, and or behavior even. So you can have a species because they're similar in behavior. So those are different other criteria, but I always learned the definition is that they can mate and produce fertile offspring within themselves. So why did we go off on that tangent and talk about species, genera, and families? And the reason why is we talked about that our herb is a different species than cardamom, and it's also a different genus. So, a couple stages away from it. However, they do share the same family. So if we didn't understand the context of family, genera, and species, we couldn't have this discussion. So they do have the same family, and that family is an interesting family. It's Zingiberaceae is what it is. That's my best attempt at pronunciation. Zingiberaceae. And this is the same family as ginger, galangal. If you're not familiar with that, that's used a lot in Thai cooking. I love it. And turmeric. So very similar to those, the same family as all of those. And all of those have a lot of antioxidant and other really, all of those that I just said, with the possible exception of galangal, have strong medical aspects to it. And galangal does as well. It's just not as used as some of the others. So, and these are all the same family. So cardamom is in that family. Our herb, Shā Rén, is in that family as well. So they're all very similar in that context. And you can also see that with those, turmeric doesn't have huge taste, but it definitely has some taste. But the others are very strong flavored plants. And so at least the parts that we use. So that is the family Zingiberaceae. So we're getting back well, we haven't gotten into it. We're going to talk about the 3 kinds of cardamom. So the most common and commonly used type is green or true cardamom, and we've been talking about that. That is Elateria cardamomum. That is when you say cardamom, that is generally what you're referring to is the green cardamom, and it does look green. You know, you buy it and it's dried, it's green. The other type is black cardamom. When you see that in its shell, the seeds are definitely black, but when you see it in its shell, it's more brown than black, but the seeds are very black. And that is Amomum subulatum. Amomum subulatum. So that is black cardamom. So now you can see that Amomum is now getting into that realm of cardamom, but it's a different species than the species of our herb. In fact, is actually listed as an adulterant of our herb. Some people will try and pass Amomum subulatum off as Amomum villosum, which is just not correct. And the reason why they will do that, and the reason why we call it an adulterant, is because I'm assuming it's a cheaper way to do that. So some unscrupulous people will substitute the Amomum subulatum instead of the Amomum villosum. The black cardamom, the Amomum subulatum, has a smoky flavor and is used in more savory dishes. The Elateria cardamomum, the green cardamom, doesn't have that smoking. It's used in a lot of different dishes and can be used in savory dishes, but it's also used a lot in desserts and things along those lines. One of my favorite Indian food, of course, desserts is the rice pudding that they have in the. I love it with that cardamom in there. It just makes it. So that is green cardamom and black cardamom. So those are 2 of the 3 types of cardamom. The 3rd type of cardamom is white cardamom. So this is an interesting one because many sources, when I investigate cardamom, say that white cardamom is actually a bleached version of the green cardamom with a milder flavor, and so that's it's the same thing as the true cardamom. It's that Elateria cardamomum, but it's been bleached, and because of that bleaching, it has a milder flavor. And the other reason why they do that is because it can then be used in baked goods, so you don't get little flakes of black or green in the baked goods. This is white, and so it blends right into baked goods, and so it makes the food more appealing at a visual level. So that's one definition of white cardamom. However, other sources indicate there's another species of Amomum entirely, and that's Amomum crevrann. Oh man, this is a hard one. It's Krervanh. Crervann. That clearly is not a Latin word, at least not that I've ever seen. So I'm sure it comes from a name of some other. Sometimes there will be people's names or names of something else. So several sources say that white cardamom is actually Amomum crevrann. So that means that of the 3 cardamoms, quote unquote cardamoms, one is true, which is Elateria cardamom, and the other 2 are of the Amomum variety. So Amomum is right in there, and our herb, Shā Rén, I swear it tastes a lot like cardamom. So maybe not all the complexity, but it's pretty close. And so Amomum's right there, even though it's a different genus and a different species. But back to the Amomum crevrann, which is the white cardamom. It is also a Chinese herb. That Chinese herb is called Baidoukou, which I didn't get the translations, but Bai means white, so it makes sense here. And it's very similar to and often used with our herb Shā Rén. So they are actually used together on occasion. It is a combination we're going to talk about in just a few. It is considered less drying, cooler, and works on the lungs and less on the spleen and stomach than our herb Shā Rén. It does not calm the fetus, which we will find out Shā Rén does. So we're going to get into that as well. So it's a little bit milder, and it goes more to the lungs. So if you have phlegm in the lungs, the Baidoukou is a better choice than our herb today, Shā Rén. So those are the 3 different cardamoms that you can actually buy. These are all on, purchasable. So cardamom is used in a lot of things and used extensively in Indian food, as we're going to find out. That's where it was first discovered and first cultivated. It was in India. So definitely used extensively in Indian food. I would say most people have tasted cardamom in chai tea. If you've ever had chai tea, it has very distinct, powerful flavors, and one of those is going to be the cardamom. I love chai tea. I don't drink it that often, and I'll explain why in just a second. But chai tea is almost a master class in herbology, often including, and again, there's lots of different recipes, so this changes, but it includes ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, star anise, fennel, and black pepper. All of those are herbs that are used both in Chinese herbology and also a lot in Ayurvedic herbology. So you understand a lot of that. It's just an amazing sort of thing in herbology. Now, I said I don't use it very often. I don't drink chai tea very often. And the reason why is if you look at every last one of those herbs I just mentioned, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, star anise, fennel, and black pepper, they're all very warming or hot in nature. So now with traditional chai tea, I believe you're supposed to have a milk product with it, which would add some cooling aspects to it. So it's a little bit balanced, but that's pretty extreme on the heat. So if I were to have chai tea and I'm already tend to run a little bit on the warm side, that would just not be good for my health. So that's why I don't have chai tea very often, but it is delicious. And if you look at a lot of these things from a Western point of view, a lot of them have anti-inflammatory functions. So if you have an inflammatory or an autoimmune condition, a lot of this could be very helpful as long as you're not hot. Cardamom is often included in a marsala daba. If you're not familiar with a marsala daba, it's an Indian spice box. You've probably seen them. It's usually a circular metal container with small metal containers inside that have spices, and it makes it easy because the individual containers inside don't have any lids. So you open up the spice box and you can scoop out very quickly all the spices you want. And often families will have multiple spice boxes for different purposes. I've been told it's a traditional gift for a woman who gets married, is that I believe it's her family will give her a spice box for her family. So it's quite a tradition, and cardamom is part of that. In general, cardamom is a spice that should be stored whole and ground just before being used. You should not buy pre-ground cardamom. It is available. I was looking at different cardamoms online. All these are available online. The white cardamom was a little bit harder to find than the black and the green cardamom, but a lot of it was ground, a lot of it was seeds, and a lot of it was whole pods. And so generally, if it were me, what I usually do, I just purchase some for a recipe we're going to talk about in just a second, and it is in seeds. So I would actually grind those up. I use a coffee grinder to grind those up, or you can use a mortar and pestle. Actually, I got to say, I have a coffee grinder for this purpose, but I can never find it. So more often than not, I use a mortar and pestle to crush them, grind them up. But that is, you should do that just before using. And we're going to find out the reason why is because there's a lot of aromatic oils in the seeds. And so if you do it, if you just have ground cardamom, then those aromatic oils over time are going to dissipate, and you're going to have a much less flavorful smell, aromatic. God, the aroma is amazing. Much less potent cardamom if you store it for long periods of time as a powder. So it should be stored as either in the pods or as seeds, and then ground just before using. I have used it. I like I said, I love cardamom. I've used it in chili as a little surprise spice. Throws in a little something to it. I have been currently I've been preparing for an acupuncture happy hour and wanted to include some mocktails with the acupuncture happy hour. If you're an acupuncturist, and you should probably know what an acupuncture happy hour. If you're not, it's just a nice little gathering where what I have is menus that are available, and they can choose. And all I do is ear acupuncture and keep them in for a while they sit and chat and have mocktails, all that sort of stuff. So, and I have a little menu that they can choose whether they want. They can say like stop smoking in the right ear and improve memory on the left ear, or what have you. So I find most of my patients actually like the pain sort of aspect. So they'll say I have low back pain, so I'll put in pain points in the ear that will help the low back. So it's really kind of cool and fun, and do it every once in a while as a fun thing. So I wanted to include some mocktails when I did one. And so, but I wanted to also kind of introduce some herbs and health items when I did that. So I actually, after a lot of research, I kind of settled on a very interesting sort of mocktail. And I'm going to have the recipe on this on the website in Sperbs Herbs. So sperbsherbs.com. So if you want to see this recipe, you can just go there and pick it up and, click on this podcast and it will be there. It's the supplemental materials. So what I actually settled on was a homemade ginger beer, which sounds complicated, but it's actually really simple to make your own ginger beer, and it's supposed to be amazing. I haven't quite gotten around to making it yet, so I can't swear by all this, but I'm excited to try it. So homemade ginger beer, and then I paired that with a shrub. If you're not familiar with a shrub is kind of an old term, and it's usually sugar and usually some sort of fruit, and then mixed with vinegar. So what you would do is you macerate a fruit, you mix it in with sugar, let it sit for a day or two, and you pour in some vinegar, and you mix that. You let that sit for a day or two, and then you take a small portion of that out and add it to water or carbonated water, or in this case, ginger beer, and you have a very nice cocktail. And some people will put alcohol with the shrubs. Shrubs are kind of interesting. They can be very strong if you don't dilute it enough, but if you dilute it, it's a very interesting flavor with everything going on. So I was going to combine the ginger beer with a pear shrub with vanilla and cardamom. So ginger is an herb in Chinese medicine, so Shenjiang. So that is that introduces the idea of herbs. Pears are very good for fluids, for the lungs. So that again is sort of a Chinese dietary concept. The vinegar I was going to do was an apple cider vinegar, which is said to have a lot of health benefits. And then the cardamom, because I love cardamom, I wanted to do that in this shrub. So that's what I was going to prepare and will prepare at some point when I do this. And so that recipe is on the website. All right, let's get into our actual herb for today. And we're talking about Shā Rén. So that's first tone, second tone. First tone and second tone. Shā Rén. So that is our herb for the day. Its English translation of Shā Rén is sand seeds. So Ren means seeds and Shā means sand, so sand seeds. It's Amomum fructus is how it is in our textbooks, but as we've been talking about, the standard species is Amomum villosum with this. But there are other species that fall under this rubric of Shā Rén, including Amomum langili, I can't even pronounce it, langili. That's a weird one, and Amomum xanthoides. In fact, a lot of the research that I came across was a lot of it was on Amomum villosum, but a lot of it was also on Amomum xanthoides. So these are all considered, they're very similar. Obviously, they're all the same genus, and they're actually very similar as species. So other names for this is Amomum fruit, Villus Amomum fruit, Grames of Paradise fruit, and as I said, cardamom, but mistakenly, they will call it cardamom. The normal dosage of this is 3 to 6 grams. So it's a lighter dosage than most herbs. Most of our herbs are in the 6 to 9 gram category. This is 3 to 6 grams. So it's a strong herb. So you should use a little bit less than the normal dosage on this. It should be added at the end of a decoction or end of a preparation because of those volatile oils. If you cook it for too long, all those volatile oils, which are very beneficial, will go up in the air in the steam. So you do want to add it to the end of a decoction. In fact, usually you stop the decoction and then add this in and just let it infuse with the warm water. And as we mentioned earlier, it should be crushed. In this case, when we use it as an herb, it should be lightly crushed. Just open them up. You don't need to make them into a powder like you might if you were cooking with it. There are some differences among sources as to what the original source for this herb, in other words, where was this first written about. In Chinese medicine, the most likely candidate is the Yao Xing Ben Sao, or the Materia Medica of Medicinal Properties. That was written by Shen Chuan in 600 CE. That's the Chinese portion of that. And then, but in India, there are some written references to cardamom, which again, is not exactly the same thing, but close, as early as 1400 to 1600 BCE. So that's a long time ago. Those of you, I'm using CE and BCE. Those of you who haven't been in school for a long time, that stands for Common Era and before the Common Era. You were not supposed to be using before Christ and after death, BC and AD anymore, because that's very Christian centric. So we use Common Era and before the Common Era, though we still use the same reference point, which is the birth of, or the death, I'm not even sure which one, of Christ. So it's still kind of Christian oriented. It's just a different term that isn't as clearly Christian oriented. So CE and BCE. Its category is aromatic herbs that transform dampness. One textbook translates as transform dampness. Another one says drain dampness. I was always kind of taught that aromatic herbs are more transformative than draining, and there are other herbs that are more draining. Draining meaning it promotes urination, so you get rid of dampness that way. Transforming means you kind of warmly transform it into something else rather than dampness. So I think probably the better translation here is aromatic herbs that transform dampness. It is spicy or acrid. Those in Chinese medicine are synonyms, so spicy, acrid. Acrid is the other way to pronounce that. Probably the better way to pronounce it, spicy and acrid. It's warm, and that does play a role. So it is quite a warming herb. And it's aromatic and enters the spleen and stomach. So aromatic is definitely a descriptor of an herb. So spicy, warm, and aromatic is the descriptor of this herb. And then it enters the spleen and stomach, which makes a lot of sense when we look at its functions. It does a lot for digestion. So we're saying it transforms dampness. So let's talk about dampness for a minute here, because we have to understand this concept of dampness if we're going to understand what this herb does. So dampness is one of the 6 pathogenic factors in Chinese medicine. Others include cold, heat, wind, those sort of things. So dampness is one of those. From a Chinese perspective, it's caused by pooling of fluids globally or in specific parts of the body. It is sticky, difficult to get rid of, heavy, slows things down, and it sinks. The way I think of dampness often, well, let me read some more of this and then no, actually this is, so the way I kind of often describe it to my patients is there's those days or those times when you feel like you're walking through jello, that everything is just really hard to move your body, and it feels like there's resistance to everything you do, not just physically but also mentally and emotionally. There's just resistance. That's dampness, that heaviness. So it causes a feeling of heaviness in the body and or head, fullness of the chest or epigastrium. The epigastrium is near the stomach. That's what it means. So under the lower rib cage, a sticky taste, urinary difficulty, and or vaginal discharge. So if you have vaginal discharge, we excessive vaginal discharge, we say that's a form of dampness. And then there's subforms, so damp heat, damp cold, things along those lines, phlegm. In addition, depending on where in the body it is manifest, dampness can cause specific signs and symptoms. So if you have it in your lungs, you probably are going to, the dampness is going to be a fullness in the lungs. And as dampness can over time transform into phlegm. And so then you start having phlegm, coughing up, and things along those lines. So that would be an idea of specific signs and symptoms depending on where the dampness actually enters. So that's a really brief overview of dampness. It gets a lot more than that, but at least it gives us an idea of what this herb can help treat. So good quality Shā Rén should have a strong aroma. The seeds should be oily and with a hard and heavy texture to them. And the fruit should be full, consistent, and uniform, and not fragmented. So you don't want broken up. That means too dry, not oily, not high quality. So the Chinese medical actions include promoting the movement of qi, and that's one source text. Another one or two say regulates the qi. Basically, it moves qi. Qi, as I've said in previous Sperbs Herbs episodes, qi is a concept we're going to get into. That's quite a concept in and of itself, but it is important in Chinese medicine. So we'll talk about qi in a bit. But what the qi is what animates us, what allows us to be alive. So qi is important, and when it stagnates, we get symptoms. So this promotes the movement of qi. It transforms or dissolves dampness. Again, different translations: transforms, dissolves, dampness. Both those I like for this herb. Strengthens the spleen. So the spleen is an interesting, if you're coming from a Western point of view, the spleen is an interesting organ in this context. Because the spleen, in a Western sense, the spleen, all it does is it's like basically a big lymph node, and it helps with the immune system. That there is similarities with that with spleen functions in Chinese medicine. However, the spleen in Chinese medicine is actually considered the primary digestive organ, even more so than the spleen and small intestine. I mean, the stomach and small intestine. And so it anything that involves digestion involves the spleen at some level. And from a Western point of view, you just have to scratch your head and go, what were the Chinese on when they said that? Let me explain. It's actually really interesting, because when you look at some of the anatomy books of Chinese medicine from the 1600s or something, they will talk about the spleen having a tail. And if you look at the spleen anatomically, it's like an odd-shaped balloon. There is no tail to the spleen whatsoever. It's all rounded edges. There is nothing that you could think of that would be a tail involving the spleen. But just below the spleen sits the long triangular pancreas. And so in Chinese medicine, when we say spleen, we're probably talking about a combination of spleen pancreas. If you look at the functions of the spleen in Chinese medicine, it combines those functions quite a lot. And when you look at it, the pancreas's main job is to develop enzymes that help break down our food. It has other things too, as we know, in insulin and those sort of things. But and again, that's all still part of to a certain extent, the digestive and storing process of digestion. So, but we can't break down food effectively without the pancreatic enzymes. And so in that context, if you include the pancreas into the Chinese term spleen, then it makes perfect sense that the Chinese spleen would be part of digestive process. So when we say strengthens the spleen, we're saying it strengthens that organ that is primary in digestion. It also warms the middle, stops diarrhea. So warming the middle is an important function. Again, that warming function that we were talking about. Stops diarrhea. Doesn't stop all diarrhea. It stops specific types of diarrhea, and especially cold or damp diarrhea. And then here's a really interesting one. One text translated this as calms the fetus. The other one says stabilizes pregnancy. But all the texts that I look at agree that it aids vomiting during pregnancy and morning sickness. So that's sort of the stabilizing pregnancy side of that. And then it calms a restless or stirring fetus. Again, different translations as well. So if you have a fetus that's moving around, this can calm the fetus. There are 4 herbs that calm the fetus, and this is one of them. And in this case, it's because of qi not moving properly. So there's some stagnation, and it makes it uncomfortable for the fetus. But a very interesting function for Shā Rén. Shā Rén is strongly aromatic, warming, drying, and comfortably spreading. That is a direct quote from one of the textbooks. Comfortably spreading. So it doesn't spread strongly. It's comfortable. A source text says called "The Transforming the Significance of Medicinal Substances" is translated in Bensky et al., which is one of the major textbooks on Chinese herbology. States its aromatic qi harmonizes the 5 organs, and follows guiding herbs to unblock and mobilize all channels. So it's a really good herb for that movement of qi. And in this context, in this quote, it says it can help the whole body, all the organs, all that. So, and by the way, when we say this context, it says the 5 organs. Chinese doesn't think there's 5 organs. There's 5 yin organs, and then 5 or 6 yin organs, and depending on how you parse it, and 6 yang organs. And so that's what it's referring to when it says the 5 organs. And then there's what we call the extraordinary organs, which are on top of those. So we have a full panoply of organs, trust me. Another translation in the same textbook from the Grand Materia Medica says it promotes qi movement and stops pain. When fetal qi is injured and disturbed, the pain is unbearable. So again, if you're moving qi, we say pain is caused by stagnation of qi and blood, and/or blood. And so one of the things we always do with pain is we try to move it, depending on the source of pain. So the promotion of qi movement should also help pain, stop pain. So that's what this is referring to. There are a few, actually only one major preparation for this, and that is called salt prepared preparation, Yan Shā Rén. And this is done, and it's used by soaking in salt water and then dry frying it. So it's just a way to prepare the herb, salt prepared. And when you do that, salt it soaks up water, as we know. It reduces some of the acrid heat, spicy heat, causing it to be less drying, causing it to direct qi and other herbs downward. It also, in that context, enhances the calm fetus function of the herb. So it basically is less strong on the drying side of things. It does change the function of the herb a little bit from spreading qi to directing qi and other herbs downward. So it actually puts a direction on that. And then it enhances the calm fetus function because it isn't as warm, it isn't as aggravating. It works well with that. It can also, in this preparation, can help warm the kidneys and inhibit urination. So in case of too much urination. So that is salt prepared, Yan Shā Rén. Something else involved with this is Shā Rén Ke, and this refers to the husk of Shā Rén. So we have the fruit of Shā Rén has a husk around it and then several seeds in the middle of it. So what we're doing, if you take the seeds out and just keep the husk, that's Shā Rén Ke, also known as Shā Rén Qiao. And it has similar functions, but is less strong and less warming than Shā Rén itself. So it can provide a gentler treatment than Shā Rén. So sometimes this is used in extreme cases where the spleen is very deficient, and this is a gentler way to approach everything. It has a couple combinations that are of importance. One of these is with Magnoliae officinalis cortex, or Hopo. They both promote the movement of qi. So Hopo is definitely, and it's an aromatic herb as well. So you have 2 aromatic herbs that are promoting the movement of qi. Hopo directs qi downward, while Shā Rén unbinds the stomach by drying dampness. So basically, think of Shā Rén as kind of unwinding things, while Hopo kind of moves qi downwards. The combination enhances these functions and is used in cases of distension and fullness of the abdomen. So that's a great combination for that. Another combination is with Citri reticulate pericarpium. This is Chen Pi is the Chinese, so very commonly used qi moving herb in Chinese medicine. And it is, I've been told, I don't quote me on this because I haven't done my research yet, but I've been told that's tangerine peel. It may be a specific type of tangerine. So that's Chen Pi. And they're used together to treat a variety of conditions, including damp obstructing the spleen and or stomach, disharmony with symptoms of diarrhea, belching, nausea, and vomiting. Together, they eliminate dampness, strongly regulate the qi, and harmonize the middle. Those are both have a lot of functions very similar. One is in the aromatic transformed damp category. That's the Shā Rén that we're talking about. The Chen Pi is in the promotion of qi, moving qi, regulate the qi category. So, but there is overlap in their functions. They just do some of those stronger than others. So this herb can be compared with a couple others. One of those we already mentioned, which is Baidoko, that we talked about. That is the white cardamom that we discussed earlier. And as we talked about then, the Baidoko focuses more on the lungs and less so on the spleen and stomach. It is used for phlegm and dampness obstructing the lungs. It does not calm the fetus. So if you want to calm the fetus, you definitely want to use our herb Shā Rén. Another herb mentioned as a potentially similar herb is Psychofructus. It's not psycho. I'm not saying psycho. Saoko, Tsao-ko fructus, and the Chinese name for this is Saoguo, which is also in the same genus. So it is an Amomum as well. Shā Rén is strongest in promoting the flow of qi, while Saoguo is strongest in warming and drying. So if you want to promote qi more than the warming and drying function, you want to use Shā Rén. If you want more warming and drying and less promotion of qi, Saoguo is the herb to go with. Can be used in combination with each other as well, though rarely. So let's talk about the science of Shā Rén. This herb appears to be very safe herb. There's one Chinese study that gave very large doses to rats for 30 days without any detrimental effects. The only thing to worry about is there have been some allergic reactions to this herb reported, but it's a spice. It's, relatively safe. Like I said, from a Chinese point of view, I'd be worried about the warming aspect of it, that you want to make sure that's balanced out to a certain extent and that you're not overdoing the warming function of this herb, so not taking too much unless you need to. So there are many claims made about Shā Rén. Many are from animal studies, low level of evidence. Most of these, even the human studies, are small. Think of these as more indications of where these herbs could be used in terms of Western medicine. Low concentration administration in rats and rabbits stimulated the intestines, so it helped digestion. But high concentrations inhibited the intestines. This might be why we have a smaller dose of this herb than some of our other herbs that we use. There is a mild antiplatelet effect in rabbits. This is important. We're going to talk about that a little bit when we get into drug-herb interactions. A rat study showed increased long bone growth. The authors of that study were actually advocating using it in cases of retarded growth. Again, rat study, not applied to humans. We have a long way to go before that's a viable treatment idea. It is used to treat nausea in humans in a small Chinese study to good effect, and that makes perfect sense given its traditional functions. Small human study looked at its use in treating peptic ulcer disease. So this would be stomach ulcers or duodenal ulcers, and improved symptoms such as epigastric pain, distension, and acid reflux. Again, small study, good indication. It goes along with our traditional functions, so that makes sense. But more science is needed. There have been some studies that have shown antibacterial effects. That was done in vitro, and I'm always worried about in vitro, especially when it comes to antibacterial, or our next effect that we're going to talk about. In vitro means not in humans, more in the lab. In vitro literally means in glass. So antibacterials, you put some bacteria together, you put a couple drops of this in, and you see the bacteria die. That doesn't mean that if you take it as a human that it's actually going to have antibacterial effects. So I'm a little skeptical of that one. It does have, in the same context, it has been shown to have some antioxidant effects. Again, not being in human, the study not being in human, give this study a grain of salt. This is an interesting one. Mice and rats showed some benefit to diabetes. There was some control of glucose in a couple mice and rat studies. So that's an interesting one. Again, mice and rats, not humans, so take it with a grain of salt. However, this one's an interesting one. It's a slightly larger study. I can't remember if this is the 47-person study or the 80-person study, both of which are relatively small, but large enough to have statistics done on them. And in these human studies, they used it to treat Helicobacter pylori infections, which is the infections that cause ulcers. And what they found, it had better results than triple therapy, which is the standard therapy used in H. pylori infections. Standard therapy in H. pylori infection is to use two antibiotics and one sort of a coating or something to help the antibiotics a little bit in order to treat H. pylori, which is a difficult bacteria to get rid of. But you need to get rid of it, otherwise you'll have those ulcers. And in this human study, small, it had better results with using an extract from Shā Rén, not cardamom, Shā Rén, and that was better than the triple therapy of drugs used as the standard. So that's an interesting study. That was over 10 years ago, in 2008. Not a lot else has been done since then, so I can't say that's a go, but I can say it's an interesting study. There are many constituents to Shā Rén, our herb. It contains many essential and volatile oils, almost too many to actually list, all of which, if you look them up, they all have some functions here or might have those functions there. It was just, if I were to get into that, we'd be talking about that only in an hour and nothing else, so I didn't want to get into it. But I did want to talk about 2-camphor and bornyl acetate, which are actually in several other herbs that we may use, that are in Chinese medicine, and both of them have been shown to have analgesic effects. So analgesic means pain, reducing pain effects. So that's definitely a good thing in there. It has some saponins, zinc, copper, iron. Everywhere I looked at this, they had totally different lists. Those are broad in general. Nothing super stands out as like, okay, this is the reason why this herb has a lot of the functions it does. Otherwise, I'd call that out. But a lot of standard stuff that's in other herbs and have been shown to have some beneficial effects. There is an issue, a concern with drug-herb interactions. There is low-level evidence that shows Shā Rén may have antiplatelet action and should be used with caution with anticoagulant drugs such as warfarin, heparin, clopidogrel, or even aspirin. So do take that into account with patients on those types of drugs. There are some concerns, contraindications for using this herb. Should not be used in patients who have blood deficiency, blazing fire. Again, it's warming, so you don't want to add that fire. Or yin deficiency heat. So yin deficiency heat can happen in anybody, but often is postmenopausal women. That's a lot in Chinese medicine. We attribute a lot of the menopausal symptoms to yin deficiency and the heat that comes from that. So should be cautious. Should not be used in patients with any of those conditions. Overconsumption by pregnant women may exhaust the qi and cause a difficult labor. You don't have enough qi to actually do a proper labor, so can be a concern there as well. So no overconsumption there. Again, therapeutically, we use 3 to 6 grams a day. So that's a relatively low dose of this. And that is everything that you want to know about Shā Rén, Amomum fructus or Amomum fructus. So another exciting episode of Sperbs Herbs, almost done. We are going to have another episode next Saturday, next week, and we're going to do our first of our series of world herbs. And this one is going to get into kava kava, a very interesting herb and a very interesting look at an herb with broad health, societal, and mythic impacts. There's fantastic myths around this. We're going to get into that. It plays a huge role in the societies that grow this. So we're going to talk about that. And of course, it has health benefits. So we're going to talk about all that. Kava kava is going to be fascinating. That's going to be next week on Sperbs Herbs. I would like to thank you for listening. Again, if you can remember when you buy from Amazon, please go to our website and click on the banner ad that's there at sperbsherbs.com. And you can always get in touch with me at Dr. Greg at sperbsherbs.com. That's DRGREG at sperbsherbs.com, or at our website and click on the Contact Us at www.sperbsherbs.com. Thank you. Sperbs Herbs. The proceeding was presented by Dr. Greg Sperber. We would like to thank Janelle for all her support and everybody else who contributed to this program.
Janelle.
Timothy
Dobbins,
Rogers,
Campbell,